In the autumn of 268 CE, 50,000 Roman soldiers stood in a Serbian valley facing the largest barbarian invasion in history. 320,000 Gothic warriors, men, women, and children, had crossed the Danube, bringing with them 2,000 wagons and the absolute certainty that the Roman Empire was finished. By the time the killing stopped, 100,000 corpses would carpet the plains of Naissus, and Rome would have bought itself another 2 centuries of existence. Think about those numbers for a second. 50,000 Romans against 320,000 Goths. A 6-to-1 disadvantage facing an invasion so massive, it moved like a migrating nation. Yet, by the end of this video, you'll understand how Emperor Claudius the Second turned certain annihilation into history's most decisive slaughter. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see the crisis of the 3rd century forever. First, the false retreat that baited 300,000 barbarians into a killing ground they built themselves. Second, the moment Roman cavalry appeared on a hilltop and Gothic confidence shattered into terror. And third, why this battle you've never heard of matters more than Thermopylae, more than Cannae, more than Alesia itself. But here's what makes this genuinely insane. How do you feed and control 320,000 people moving through enemy territory? What made the Goths think they could actually destroy Rome when every previous invasion had failed? Why did Claudius choose this specific valley for his final stand? How do you pursue and massacre a retreating horde that spans miles? And why did Rome's own historians try to bury this victory? To understand how 50,000 legionaries saved Western civilization, we need to go back to when the empire itself was drowning in blood. The year 268 found the Roman Empire in its death throes, though most Romans didn't realize they were watching civilization's final act. For 50 years, the crisis of the 3rd century had transformed the Mediterranean superpower into a fragmenting horror show. 26 emperors had seized power in those 5 decades. 25 had died violently, assassinated, murdered by their own troops, or killed in battle against barbarians who sensed weakness, like sharks smell blood. The frontiers were collapsing. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube at will. Persian armies ravaged the eastern provinces. Plague swept through cities already depopulated by civil war. The economy had collapsed so completely that Roman coins were 90% base metal, their silver content a distant memory. Tax collection had become armed robbery. Legions fought each other while barbarians looted at will. This wasn't decline. This was disintegration in real time. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how bad things actually were. In the single year of 260, Rome had 6 different emperors. 6, each one murdered by the forces of the next. The Praetorian Guard had become kingmakers who auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder, then murdered the winner when his money ran out. The empire's population had crashed from 70 million to 50 million in just 30 years. Plague, war, and economic collapse had killed 20 million people, nearly a third of Rome's entire civilization. The military situation was even worse than the body count suggested. Rome's legions, once the most disciplined killing machines in history, had devolved into regional warlords with flags. Legions in Britain fought legions in Gaul. Syrian forces battled Egyptian armies. The Rhine frontier, which had held for 3 centuries, now resembled Swiss cheese. Germanic tribes crossed at will, raiding deep into Gaul and Italy itself. In 259, Alemanni warriors had reached Milan. Milan, that's 600 miles inside Roman territory. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The empire was still trying to maintain 40 legions, 200,000 professional soldiers, spread across frontiers that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Except these weren't really legions anymore. They were undermanned, undersupplied, under-equipped fragments commanded by generals who cared more about seizing power than defending borders. The average legion in 268 numbered maybe 3,000 effectives instead of the traditional 5,500. Do the math. That's barely 120,000 combat-ready troops defending millions of square miles of territory against enemies who outnumbered them 10 to 1. The economic catastrophe made everything worse. Inflation had destroyed the currency so completely that soldiers demanded payment in goods instead of coins. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than face the tax collectors who operated more like bandits. Cities that had thrived for centuries were literally shrinking inside their walls. Populations huddling in urban centers that were becoming ruins even as people still lived in them. Rome itself had dropped from over 1 million inhabitants to perhaps 500,000. Think about what this means. The greatest empire in Western history was cannibalizing itself. The machine that had conquered the Mediterranean world was tearing itself apart from the inside, while barbarians circled like vultures. Every metric pointed toward total collapse within a decade, maybe 2. The only question was which group of barbarians would carve up the corpse. Then the Goths decided to end the suspense. In the summer of 267, intelligence reached the fractured imperial court that made even hardened generals go pale. A Gothic confederation was assembling north of the Danube. Not 20,000 raiders, not 50,000 warriors looking for plunder. 320,000 Goths, bringing their families, their livestock, 2,000 supply wagons, and the absolute conviction that they were about to witness the Roman Empire's final chapter. What happened next would either save Western civilization or bury it forever. The Gothic confederation that assembled north of the Danube in 267 represented something Rome had never faced before. Not an army, but a migration armed for conquest. 320,000 Goths, Heruli, Gepids, and allied tribes gathered along the river's northern bank with a plan that terrified Roman intelligence officers. They weren't raiding. They weren't seeking plunder to take home. They were coming to stay, bringing their families, their livestock, 2,000 supply wagons, and the absolute conviction that the Roman Empire was finished. Previous Gothic invasions had numbered 20, maybe 30,000 warriors. This was 10 times larger. The logistics alone defied comprehension. How do you move 320,000 people across a major river? How do you feed them? How do you maintain any semblance of order in a horde that large? The Goths had answers. They'd spent a generation planning this, watching Roman weakness grow, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Here's what the Roman scouts reported back, and why it made the imperial court panic. Of those 320,000 people, roughly 120,000 were fighting-age males. Warriors who'd been training their entire lives for this moment. The remaining 200,000 were women, children, elderly. The entire Gothic nation pulling up stakes and moving south. They'd brought 8,000 wagons initially, but consolidated down to 2,000 of the sturdiest for the river crossing. Each wagon carried supplies for a month, plus the tools needed to establish permanent settlements. This wasn't an invasion. It was a colonization attempt backed by the largest barbarian army ever assembled. The tribal breakdown reveals the unprecedented nature of this threat. The Thervingi Goths provided 80,000 warriors under their king Canabaudes. The Greuthungi added another 30,000. The Heruli, vicious raiders from the northern steppes, contributed 10,000 horsemen. Smaller tribes, Gepids, Basternais, Carpi, filled out the remaining numbers. Think about what it took to unite these groups. Germanic tribes spent more time fighting each other than fighting Rome. Blood feuds went back generations. Yet somehow, the Goths had convinced dozens of tribes that now was the moment to permanently end Roman power north of the Mediterranean. But here's where Gothic confidence became Gothic genius. They didn't just gather an army. They'd been conducting reconnaissance for 5 years. Gothic scouts had mapped every Roman fortress on the Danube. They knew which garrisons were undermanned, which commanders were competent, which supply depots held the most grain. They'd identified the crossing points where the Danube ran shallow in late summer. They'd even negotiated with tribes already inside Roman territory, securing promises of support once the invasion began. This was strategic planning on a scale barbarians supposedly weren't capable of. The crossing itself took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of controlled chaos as 120,000 warriors, 200,000 civilians, thousands of livestock, and 2,000 wagons moved across the Danube at 5 different points simultaneously. Roman frontier forces, outnumbered 20-1 at each crossing, could only watch and send desperate messages south. By mid-August of 267, the entire Gothic nation stood on Roman soil. Gothic chieftains gathered for a war council that would decide the invasion's direction. The debate was fierce. Some wanted to strike west toward the wealthy cities of Pannonia. Others advocated moving south through Moesia toward Thrace and the empire's agricultural heartland. The final decision revealed their ultimate ambition. They would move southeast toward Naissus and the Balkans, driving deep into Roman territory before Rome could concentrate its scattered legions. They would force a decisive battle, destroy whatever army Rome scraped together, and prove, once and for all, that the empire was finished. What the Gothic chieftains didn't know was that their invasion route, their timeline, even their confidence, all of it was exactly what one Roman emperor was counting on. Claudius Gothicus was about to teach the barbarian world a lesson it would never forget. But first, he needed them to come deeper into the trap. Marcus Aurelius Claudius had seized power just months earlier, and Rome's senators considered him yet another doomed general playing at emperor. He was 54 years old, a career soldier from Illyria who'd fought on every frontier Rome possessed. His nickname, Gothicus, wouldn't come until after Naissus, but soldiers already called him, quote, one for his approach to discipline and combat. Where other emperors schemed and politicked, Claudius drilled his troops. Where others sought accommodation with barbarians, Claudius prepared for extermination. He'd watched the empire bleed for decades, watched emperors fall because they tried to be clever instead of decisive. When scouts brought news of the Gothic superhorde crossing the Danube, most of Rome's remaining legions were scattered across the provinces, fighting each other in endless civil wars. Claudius had perhaps 60,000 men he could trust, and half of those were exhausted from recent campaigns. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Rome was going to die unless someone did something unprecedented. Here's what made Claudius different from the 25 emperors who died before him. He'd spent 30 years in the legions, rising from common soldier to tribune through sheer competence, in an era when competence usually got you killed by jealous superiors. He'd fought Goths in Moesia, Persians in Syria, usurpers in Gaul. He knew exactly how bad Rome's military situation was because he'd personally witnessed the deterioration. In 267, when Emperor Gallienus was assassinated, Claudius seized power not through ambition, but through grim necessity. Someone had to stop the bleeding, and the senators certainly weren't going to do it. His first act as emperor revealed his priorities. While other new emperors rushed to Rome to secure political support, Claudius stayed with his army. He spent his first month as emperor not in the palace, but in military camps, personally inspecting every unit, executing incompetent officers, drilling formations that had grown lazy. Veterans who'd served under a dozen emperors said they'd never seen anything like it. Claudius didn't just command the army. He rebuilt it soldier by soldier. The force he assembled for the Gothic crisis numbered 53,000 combat effectives. Think about that number. The Roman Empire at its height had fielded 30 legions, 165,000 men. Claudius had less than a third of that to face an invasion 6 times larger than anything Rome had encountered in living memory. But here's where his genius emerged. Quality over quantity. Every man in his army was a veteran. Every century was drilled to perfection. Every unit had officers who'd proven themselves in actual combat rather than political maneuvering. His strategic vision went deeper than just drilling troops. Claudius understood something fundamental about barbarian invasions that other emperors had missed. The Goths weren't just militarily dangerous. They were psychologically convinced of Roman weakness. Every successful raid, every unpunished crossing, every Roman retreat had reinforced their belief that the empire was finished. This confidence was their weakness. A confident enemy commits fully. A committed enemy can be destroyed completely. When the reports came in detailing the Gothic invasion route, 320,000 people moving southeast through Moesia, Claudius saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. The Senate begged him to abandon the Balkans, pull back to defend Italy itself. His own generals suggested negotiating, offering the Goths land in exchange for peace. Claudius rejected every compromise. Instead, he gave orders that made his staff think he'd gone mad. He would concentrate his entire army at Naissus, a city in the Goths' direct path. He would let them come to him. He wouldn't try to stop their advance or harass their supply lines or delay their movement. He would give them exactly what they wanted, a decisive battle against Rome's last field army. Then he would kill every last one of them. His officers protested. The numbers were impossible. 6-to-1 odds. The Goths had cavalry, siege equipment, overwhelming numerical superiority. Claudius listened to every objection, then gave the order anyway. "We're not trying to defeat them," he said. "We're trying to exterminate them. There's a difference." What happened next would prove him either the greatest military mind of the 3rd century or the emperor who presided over Rome's final destruction. The Gothic horde that poured across the Danube in early 268 moved like a locust swarm that thought. They hadn't chosen their invasion route randomly. The valleys leading south from the river toward the Balkans offered grazing for livestock, water for the massive column, and multiple parallel routes that prevented the entire horde from bunching up. But here's where Gothic confidence became Gothic blindness. An army of 320,000 doesn't move fast. The supply wagons alone stretched for miles. Women and children slowed the advance to a crawl. Every night, they needed to establish a defended camp large enough to protect the entire horde. Every day, they consumed supplies that stripped the countryside bare. Roman scouts shadowed them constantly, counting, measuring, reporting back to Claudius. The Goths were powerful, yes. Numerous, absolutely. But they were also predictable, ponderous, and increasingly desperate for the kind of decisive victory that would give them permanent territory. They needed to destroy a Roman field army. They needed to prove Rome was finished. And Claudius was going to give them exactly the battle they craved. Here's what the logistics actually looked like, and why it doomed the Goths before the first sword was drawn. 320,000 people consume approximately 640,000 pounds of food per day. That's 320 tons. Daily. The 2,000 supply wagons they'd brought could carry perhaps 4,000 tons total. Enough for 6 days if rationed strictly, 3 days if consumed normally. After that, they needed to live off the land, which meant stripping every farm, every village, every granary within 50 miles of their route. The Roman scouts watching this migration reported details that revealed the invasion's fatal flaw. The Gothic column stretched for 15 miles when fully extended. 15 miles of humanity, livestock, wagons, all moving at the pace of the slowest elements. On a good day, they covered 12 miles. On bad days, less than 8. Distance from the Danube to Naissus, roughly 200 miles. That meant at least 20 days of constant marching through increasingly hostile territory, where every supply depot had been emptied or burned by Roman advance forces. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Goths couldn't forage effectively because they couldn't split up. A migration this size had to stay concentrated for defense. Small foraging parties would be picked off by Roman cavalry. Large foraging expeditions meant the main column stopped moving, losing precious time. So they consumed what was immediately available along their route and kept marching, watching their supplies dwindle with every passing day. Claudius, receiving daily intelligence reports, watched the Gothic supply situation deteriorate with grim satisfaction. His scouts counted the livestock being slaughtered for food. First the excess cattle, then the breeding stock, finally the oxen pulling the wagons themselves. They reported Gothic foraging parties ranging farther from the main column, growing more desperate. By the 3rd week of the march, the invasion was consuming itself to stay mobile. The Gothic War Council, meeting each evening to review the day's progress, began to understand their predicament. They'd planned for a quick campaign, cross the Danube, smash whatever Roman forces they encountered, establish permanent settlements in the wealthy Balkan provinces. Instead, they were trudging through deliberately devastated countryside, their supplies evaporating, their timeline slipping away. Warriors who'd crossed the Danube with supreme confidence began to mutter. Women worried about their children. The elderly couldn't maintain the pace. Then came the news that changed everything. Roman cavalry, observing from distant hilltops, had been spotted in greater numbers. Not raiding, not harassing, just watching. And behind them, smoke from multiple camps. Big camps. The kind that housed legions, not frontier garrisons. Claudius wasn't running. He was waiting. Gothic chieftains called an emergency council. They faced a terrible choice. Turn back and admit failure, losing face and probably triggering the Confederation's collapse. Continue forward on dwindling supplies, hoping to catch and destroy the Roman army before starvation did their work for them. Or attempt to settle where they were, in devastated territory that couldn't support 1/10 of their numbers. They chose to accelerate. The entire horde began force marching toward Naissus, driving hard to close with the Roman army before logistics destroyed them. It was exactly what Claudius had been waiting for. Exhausted, hungry, desperate barbarians marching straight into the killing ground he'd prepared. The trap was set. Now he just needed them to walk into it. Claudius understood something about barbarian psychology that would save the empire. The Goths weren't just invading, they were performing. Every warrior in that massive horde had heard stories of Roman weakness, watched previous raids succeed, convinced themselves that this was the generation that would finally break Rome's power. They wanted battle. They needed it. Their entire invasion hinged on destroying Roman field armies and proving that the empire's military reputation was a lie. So Claudius gave them what they wanted, with modifications. His orders to frontier commanders were precise and utterly counterintuitive. Engage the Goths, harass them, make them think you're trying to stop them, then retreat. Not in panic, but in measured withdrawal, always staying just out of reach, always keeping the Gothic horde moving south. The Goths were already committed to their invasion route, already moving through the Balkans toward the wealthy cities of Thrace and Macedonia. Claudius didn't need to redirect them. He just needed to accelerate their timeline, make them hungry for the decisive battle, exhaust their supplies, and draw them deeper into Roman territory with every engagement. The first engagement came on September 3rd, near the town of Marcianopolis. A Roman auxiliary force, 3,000 mixed cavalry and infantry, encountered the Gothic vanguard. The Romans formed up, looking like they intended to contest the Gothic advance. The Goths, outnumbering them 20-1, prepared for easy slaughter. Then, after just 90 minutes of skirmishing, the Romans withdrew in perfect formation. Not routing, not panicking, just methodically pulling back while maintaining unit cohesion. The Goths pursued for 5 miles before the Romans simply outdistanced them and disappeared. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about this retreat. It was choreographed down to the minute. The Roman commander, a veteran tribune named Marcius, had explicit orders. Engage long enough to make the Goths commit forces, inflict casualties if possible, then withdraw southeast, always toward Naissus. Make them think you're running scared. Make them think they're winning. Most importantly, make them believe the next engagement will be the one where they finally catch and destroy the fleeing Romans. The pattern repeated itself 7 times over the next 3 weeks. September 7th, 4,000 Romans engaged Gothic cavalry near Abritus, killed 200 in a brief clash, then withdrew. September 12th, a full legion, 5,000 men, formed battle lines outside Nicopolis, held for 3 hours against massive Gothic assault, then retreated in the night. September 18th, Roman forces actually abandoned a fortified position, leaving supplies behind that the Goths desperately needed. Every engagement reinforced the same message. Rome was afraid, Rome was retreating, Rome was there for the taking if the Goths just pushed a little harder. But here's where Claudius's genius becomes terrifying. Each retreat pulled the Gothic horde exactly where he wanted them. The abandoned fort near Nicopolis, positioned on the direct route to Naissus. The supply depot left behind. Just enough food to keep the Goths moving, not enough to let them rest and resupply properly. The skirmishes that inflicted Gothic casualties, always targeting their cavalry, the one advantage they had over Roman heavy infantry. By late September, the Goths had lost 3,000 horsemen to defeated Roman forces. 3,000 irreplaceable mounted warriors picked off in skirmishes the Goths thought they were winning. Gothic chieftains, reviewing their string of victories, grew increasingly confident and increasingly frustrated. They'd chased Romans across 200 miles of territory. They'd won every engagement. Yet somehow, they hadn't destroyed a single Roman unit. The enemy kept slipping away, kept retreating, kept refusing the decisive battle that would break Rome's back forever. The frustration was making them reckless. Force marches became longer. Rest stops became shorter. The pursuit was consuming supplies faster than foraging could replace them. Claudius, receiving reports from his scouts embedded with Gothic refugees and captured prisoners, watched the psychological transformation with satisfaction. The Goths weren't thinking strategically anymore. They were thinking emotionally. Every Roman retreat felt like an insult, proof that Rome was too cowardly to stand and fight. Gothic warriors wanted blood. Gothic chieftains wanted glory. The entire confederation wanted the validation of crushing Rome's army in open battle. On September 24th, Gothic scouts reported the news their leaders had been waiting for. The Romans had stopped retreating. A massive Roman army, legionary standards visible for miles, had deployed across the plains of Naissus. Finally, the decisive battle. Finally, the chance to prove Roman weakness. Finally, the opportunity to write their names in history as the warriors who destroyed Rome. The Goths accelerated toward Naissus, exhausted but triumphant. They'd forced the Romans to stand. They dictated the terms. They outnumbered the enemy 6-1. This was going to be glorious. What they didn't know was that every step toward that waiting Roman army was a step deeper into the most sophisticated killing ground the ancient world had ever constructed. The plains surrounding the city of Naissus, modern Niš in Serbia, offered everything Claudius needed for the kind of battle that would decide the empire's fate. The valley was broad enough for massive armies to deploy, but narrow enough to prevent Gothic numbers from becoming overwhelming. Hills flanked the approaches, perfect for hiding reserves. The Margus River curved through the landscape, providing a natural obstacle that could channel enemy movement. Most importantly, the terrain favored disciplined infantry over tribal war bands. The Goths would arrive exhausted from weeks of marching, their supply situation increasingly desperate, their confidence sky-high from chasing retreating Romans. Claudius would be waiting with 50,000 legionaries who'd spent those same weeks preparing defenses, stockpiling supplies, and drilling for the kind of formation fighting that Gothic warriors hadn't faced in a generation. The emperor personally surveyed every approach, calculating fields of fire for his archers, positioning his cavalry wings, preparing fallback positions. This wouldn't be a battle. It would be a slaughter. But first, he needed to make absolutely certain the Goths committed everything to the attack. Here's what made Naissus the perfect killing ground. The valley measured roughly 4 miles wide at its broadest point, narrowing to just 2 miles where the Margus curved closest to the eastern hills. A Gothic army of 320,000 could deploy in that space, but they'd be compressed, unable to use their numerical advantage effectively. Their flanks would be vulnerable to cavalry charges from the hills. Their rear ranks would be too far from the fighting to contribute. And most critically, once committed to battle in that valley, retreat would become a nightmare. Thousands of warriors trying to flee through narrow passages while Roman cavalry hunted them. Claudius spent 2 full weeks preparing the battlefield with an engineer's precision. His surveyors marked exact positions for each legion, ensuring clear lines of advance and retreat. Supply depots were positioned just behind the main lines. Food, water, arrows, replacement weapons, all within minutes of the fighting. Field hospitals were established in the city itself, with wagons ready to evacuate wounded. Every detail was calculated, every contingency planned. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Claudius deployed his 50,000 men in a formation that looked like a tactical disaster. His main line was deliberately thin, just 3 ranks deep in places where Roman doctrine called for 6. His flanks appeared weak, protected only by what looked like token cavalry forces. His center seemed compressed, as if he was trying to pack too many men into too small a space. To Gothic scouts observing from the hills, the Roman deployment looked amateur, desperate. The work of an emperor who didn't understand how to use his troops effectively. Every bit of it was theater. Those weak flanks hid 10,000 elite cataphracts behind the eastern hills, completely invisible to Gothic reconnaissance. That compressed center actually maximized the effectiveness of Roman archery, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the valley into a death trap. That thin main line could be reinforced in minutes from reserves positioned in depth. Claudius was offering the Goths what looked like a flawed Roman army, begging to be flanked and destroyed. The supply situation told the real story. Roman quartermasters had stockpiled enough food for 60 days of siege. Water came from wells inside Naissus's walls, making the Romans immune to any attempt to cut their supply lines. Most critically, Claudius had positioned 3,000 arrows per archer. 9 million arrows total. Think about that number. 9 million. The Romans could sustain 3 hours of maximum rate archery before running low. 3 hours of steel rain that would turn daylight into darkness. Gothic scouts, reporting back to their chieftains, saw only what Claudius wanted them to see. A Roman army outnumbered, poorly deployed, trapped against a city with nowhere to retreat. The perfect target for the decisive victory that would break Roman power forever. The Gothic War Council met on the evening of September 26th and reached unanimous decision. They would attack at dawn. They would destroy this Roman army. They would prove that the empire's days were finished. Claudius, receiving intelligence about the Gothic decision, allowed himself a rare smile. They were going to commit everything. All 120,000 warriors, all their tribal pride, all their confidence. They were going to pour into that valley like water into a funnel, and he was going to slaughter them by the thousands. As the sun set on September 26th, 50,000 Romans sharpened their blades and prepared for the battle that would save Western civilization. The Gothic horde settled into their massive camp, already celebrating the victory they were certain would come at sunrise. Neither side would sleep much that night. But only one side knew what was actually about to happen. By the time the Gothic vanguard sighted the Roman army deployed across the Naissus plains, their leaders were certain they'd already won. Why wouldn't they be? For 6 weeks, they'd chased Roman forces southward. Every engagement had ended in Roman retreat. The few stands Roman commanders had attempted had crumbled under Gothic pressure. The invasion was proceeding exactly as planned. 320,000 warriors, secure in the knowledge that Rome was collapsing, now faced what looked like Rome's last field army, and it was outnumbered 6 to 1. Gothic chieftains called their war council and reached an obvious conclusion. One decisive victory here would break Roman power in the Balkans forever. Cities would open their gates rather than face siege. The wealthy provinces of Greece and Macedonia would be theirs for the taking. They'd carved out kingdoms from the corpse of the Roman Empire. The only question was how to divide the plunder. But here's what the Gothic scouts missed in their confidence. Those weren't defensive positions the Romans were preparing. They were bait. The Gothic War Council on the evening of September 26th bordered on celebration. King Cannibaldes of the Thervingi outlined the attack plan with the confidence of a man describing something already accomplished. His 80,000 warriors would form the center, smashing through the thin Roman lines through sheer weight of numbers. The Greutungi cavalry, 30,000 horsemen, would sweep around both flanks, encircling the Romans before they could retreat. The remaining tribal contingents would form the reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Simple, brutal, inevitable. Here's what the Gothic intelligence had completely missed. Those Roman cavalry forces on the flanks numbered maybe 2,000 visible horsemen. Gothic scouts counted them, reported back, and the chieftains laughed. 2,000 cavalry against 30,000? The Romans weren't even trying. What the scouts didn't see, couldn't see from their vantage points, were the 10,000 cataphracts hidden in the valleys behind the eastern hills. Heavy cavalry in full armor, holding absolutely still, waiting for the signal that would turn Gothic confidence into Gothic catastrophe. The numbers told a story of inevitable victory. 120,000 Gothic warriors against 50,000 Romans. The Goths had faced worse odds and won. Their warriors were battle-hardened from decades of raiding. Their nobility fought in fine mail armor imported from Roman workshops, wielding swords that could cleave shields. Their morale was sky-high from 6 weeks of chasing terrified Romans. Think about that psychological advantage. Every warrior in that Gothic army believed he was part of the generation that would finally break Rome. They'd seen Romans retreat again and again. Why would tomorrow be any different? But here's where Gothic confidence became Gothic blindness. They weren't analyzing the battle. They were imagining the aftermath. Chieftains discussed which provinces they'd claim. Warriors argued over who would get first pick of Roman plunder. Women prepared to enter Roman cities as conquerors. The entire Gothic nation had mentally already won the battle that hadn't been fought yet. This psychological commitment was exactly what Claudius needed. An enemy convinced of victory doesn't probe defenses carefully. They don't look for traps. They attack with everything they have. The Gothic camp that night was chaos masquerading as celebration. 120,000 warriors, 200,000 civilians, all crammed into a massive encampment that sprawled for miles. Fires burned everywhere. Warriors sharpened weapons, checked armor, boasted about the glory they'd win at dawn. The noise was tremendous. Thousands of conversations in a dozen dialects, livestock bellowing, children running through the camps despite the late hour. It was the sound of a nation convinced it was about to make history. Across the valley, the Roman camp was silent. Claudius had ordered absolute quiet after sunset. 50,000 legionaries lay in their tents, weapons within arm's reach, trying to grab sleep before the horror that was coming. Officers moved between units, checking equipment one final time. Centurions whispered final instructions to their men. The only sounds were the footsteps of sentries and the occasional clink of armor being adjusted. The contrast was stark. Gothic celebration versus Roman silence. Barbarian confidence versus imperial preparation. At midnight, Claudius walked the lines personally. Legionaries who saw him said later he stopped at every cohort, speaking briefly to centurions, sometimes addressing the men directly. His message was simple and terrifying in its honesty. Tomorrow, they'll come at us with everything they have. 6 warriors for every one of us. They think they've already won. Our job is to teach them the difference between winning and surviving. Then he'd move to the next unit, purple cloak barely visible in the darkness, leaving behind men who understood exactly what was expected of them. Dawn of September 27th broke clear and cold. The Gothic army began forming up at first light, a process that took 3 hours given their size. Claudius watched from his command position and saw exactly what he'd been waiting for. The Goths were committing everything. Every warrior, every tribal contingent, no reserves being held back. They were so certain of victory, they weren't even hedging their bets. What happened in the next 12 hours would either save the Roman Empire or end it forever. Claudius deployed his 50,000 legionaries in a formation that military historians would study for the next 1,000 years. The center consisted of 30,000 heavy infantry, legionaries in the classic tradition, though their equipment was less standardized than the glory days of Trajan. These men formed a dense rectangle, shields overlapping, spears bristling outward like a hedgehog's quills. Behind them stood the reserves, another 10,000 men ready to rotate forward as frontline units tired. The wings held 5,000 cavalry each, though calling them cavalry understates their sophistication. These were Roman cataphracts, heavy horsemen in scale armor, trained to fight as shock troops. But the real innovation was what you couldn't see. Claudius had positioned contingents of archers and slingers in depth, creating killing zones that would activate once the Goths committed to their attack. Supply depots sat just behind the lines. Field hospitals were prepared for casualties. Engineers had prepared obstacles and barriers that could be deployed to channel Gothic attacks. This wasn't just an army. It was a machine designed for industrial-scale killing. Here's what the formation actually looked like from ground level, and why it was so terrifying. The front line stretched 2 miles across the valley floor. 30,000 legionaries formed into 60 centuries of 500 men each. Each century deployed 8 ranks deep, shields locked in the testudo formation that had conquered the known world. The spacing was precise. 3 feet between each man, enough room to swing a gladius. Tight enough that the shield wall remained unbroken. Think about the mathematics. 2 miles of unbroken shield wall, 8 men deep, every soldier a veteran who drilled this formation 1,000 times. Behind the main line, the reserve cohorts waited in checkerboard formation. Gaps between units that allowed fresh troops to rotate forward without breaking the line. This was the key to Roman endurance. While Gothic warriors fought until exhaustion, Roman legionaries rotated every 20 minutes. Fresh men replaced tired ones with mechanical precision. The killing could continue for hours without the Roman line weakening. But here's where Claudius's genius becomes visible. Between the reserve cohorts, he'd positioned 3,000 archers in staggered rows, not clustered together where one Gothic charge could overwhelm them, but dispersed in packets of 50 men, each packet with clear sight lines over the main infantry line. These weren't auxiliary bowmen with hunting bows. These were Syrian and Cretan professionals carrying composite recurve bows that could punch arrows through mail at 200 yards. Each archer had 1,000 arrows in quivers behind their positions. 3 million arrows total, pre-positioned, ready to create a steel hurricane. The slingers added another dimension of terror. 2,000 Balearic professionals, legendary for accuracy, deployed between the archer packets. Their lead bullets, each stamped with messages like, "Take this," and "For your pain," could shatter bones at 150 yards. Roman engineers had spent weeks casting 40,000 pounds of ammunition, individual bullets weighing half a pound each, designed to kill through armor by sheer kinetic impact. The artillery completed the killing ground. 30 ballista and 20 scorpions, positioned on slight elevations behind the main line, had pre-sighted firing solutions for every approach. Ballista bolts weighed 8 pounds and could pierce 3 men in a row. Scorpions fired smaller but faster projectiles, designed to punch through shields and armor. Ammunition piles sat beside each engine, 200 bolts per ballista, 300 per scorpion. The math was brutal. These 50 engines of war could sustain 2 shots per minute for 90 minutes before running low. That's 9,000 heavy projectiles capable of killing multiple warriors each. But here's what made this formation truly revolutionary. Communication. Claudius had established a signal system using colored flags that would let him command 50,000 men in real time. Red flag, advance. Blue, hold position. Yellow, refuse the flank. White, general retreat. Green, cavalry charge. From his command position on a low hill behind the center, Claudius could see the entire battlefield and adjust tactics minute by minute. This wasn't ancient warfare where generals committed troops and hoped for the best. This was modern command and control, 2,000 years ahead of its time. The visible Roman cavalry, those 2,000 horsemen the Goths had counted and dismissed, served a specific purpose. They were the bait within the bait. light cavalry on average horses, deliberately positioned to look vulnerable. Their orders were simple. Let the Gothic cavalry commit. Let them think they're winning the flanks. Then signal the real cavalry hidden in the hills. The cataphracts would do the actual killing. At 9 a.m. on September 27th, every element was in position. 30,000 heavy infantry locked shields. 10,000 reserves stood ready. 3,000 archers tested bowstrings. 2,000 slingers loaded their first bullets. 50 artillery pieces elevated for maximum range. And hidden behind the eastern hills, 10,000 cataphracts waited for the signal that would turn this battle into Rome's salvation or its final humiliation. Across the valley, 120,000 Gothic warriors began their advance. The ground itself trembled under their footsteps. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Western civilization survived. The Gothic assault began at dawn, and the sound alone was terrifying. A roar from 300,000 throats that echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder. The sheer mass of humanity moving forward defied comprehension. This wasn't a coordinated attack in the Roman sense. It was a migration deciding to fight. Wave after wave of tribal warriors surging toward the Roman lines with the confidence of men who'd never faced serious resistance. The first ranks were the elite Gothic nobility in their mail shirts and helmets, carrying long swords and round shields. Behind them came thousands of lesser warriors, some well-armed, others carrying little more than spears in desperation. The flanks held the cavalry, horse warriors who'd learned their craft on the steppes. Women and older children watched from the rear, certain they were witnessing the death blow to Roman tyranny. The Roman response was silence. Claudius had ordered his men to save their breath. As the Gothic horde closed to 400 yards, the silence broke. Roman trumpets sounded, and 30,000 legionaries began beating their swords against their shields in perfect rhythm. The psychological impact was instant and terrifying. The rhythmic hammering, clang, 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 created a sound like the heartbeat of some mechanical god. 30,000 men striking shields in perfect unison. The sound carried across the valley, drowning out Gothic war cries, replacing barbarian chaos with Roman order. Warriors in the Gothic front ranks faltered just for a moment, confronted with something they'd never experienced. Romans who weren't running. Romans who weren't afraid. Romans who were ready. At 350 yards, Claudius raised his right hand. Every Roman eye locked on that purple-cloaked figure on the hill. The hand dropped. 3,000 archers released simultaneously. The first volley arced into the morning sky, 3,000 arrows that peaked at 100 feet before descending like iron rain. Flight time, 4 seconds. Gothic warriors, still charging, looked up at the shadow crossing the sun. Then the arrows arrived. Here's what 3,000 arrows do to a densely packed formation. They don't just kill the men they hit directly. They wound dozens more. They create chaos. Warriors stumble over fallen comrades. The charge momentum breaks. The neat tribal formations dissolve into confused knots of men trying to advance while stepping over the screaming wounded. The first volley killed maybe 400 Goths outright, wounded 1,000 more. But it broke the charge's rhythm. The archers didn't wait. Every 6 seconds, another volley. 3,000 arrows, then 3,000 more, then 3,000 more. By the time the Gothic front ranks closed to 200 yards, they'd absorbed 7 volleys. 21,000 arrows into a formation that was compressing tighter as rear ranks pushed forward. The math becomes horrific. 21,000 arrows into a space roughly 400 yards wide by 100 yards deep. That's 1 arrow for every 2 square yards of ground. Warriors are tripping over corpses, slipping on blood, trying to maintain courage while death literally rains from the sky. At 200 yards, the slingers opened fire. 2,000 Balearic professionals, each capable of 6 shots per minute. Lead bullets moving at 200 feet per second, invisible until impact. The sound was distinctive. A wet thud as half-pound projectiles shattered skulls, broke arms, caved in chests even through armor. Unlike arrows that you could sometimes see coming, sling bullets were death from nowhere. 1 second you're charging, the next your shield arm is useless, bone protruding through skin. But here's where Gothic courage became Gothic tragedy. They kept coming. 80,000 warriors charging uphill into arrow storm and sling bullets, watching comrades die by the hundreds. But they kept coming, because turning back meant dishonor. The front ranks, decimated by missiles, finally closed to 100 yards. Close enough to see individual Roman faces, close enough to smell the blood already soaking into the valley floor. That's when the artillery opened fire. 30 ballista, 20 scorpions, all pre-sighted for exactly this range. Ballista bolts, 8 pounds of iron-tipped oak, smashed into the Gothic mass. Each bolt killed 3, 4, sometimes 5 men, punching through shields and bodies like they were parchment. Scorpion projectiles, smaller but faster, targeted the Gothic nobility in their distinctive armor. At this range, nothing could stop them. Mail shirts might as well have been cloth. The Gothic charge, which had started as an avalanche of humanity, reached the Roman lines as a staggering, bleeding mass of warriors who'd lost a quarter of their front ranks to missiles alone. They'd crossed 400 yards of killing ground, losing 10,000 men before making contact with a single Roman sword. Yet still they came, crashing into the shield wall with the momentum of desperate courage, certain that once they closed to sword range, their numbers would overwhelm Roman discipline. They were about to learn why Roman legionaries had conquered the world. The real killing was just beginning. The first Gothic wave hit the Roman center like a tsunami striking a seawall, and the seawall held. Legionaries in the front rank dropped to one knee, shields braced, spears angled upward. The ranks behind them thrust their spears over the first line's shoulders, creating an impenetrable wall of steel. Gothic warriors, expecting the Roman line to buckle under their charge's momentum, instead found themselves impaling themselves on Roman spears. The press of bodies behind them made retreat impossible. Men died standing up, unable to fall because of the crowd. This is where Roman discipline became the deadliest weapon in history. While Goths in the front ranks died, legionaries in the Roman formation rotated every 15 minutes. Fresh men replaced tired ones with machine precision. The killing never stopped. Gothic corpses began piling up, creating obstacles that forced later waves to climb over their own dead. Roman archers, positioned in depth, fired over the infantry's heads into the Gothic rear ranks. 30,000 arrows per hour. A steel rain that turned the ground black with shafts. Gothic warriors couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, could only die where they stood. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the mechanics of mass slaughter. The Roman front line wasn't trying to kill quickly. They were trying to wound efficiently. A spear thrust to the thigh drops a warrior but doesn't kill him immediately. Now he's screaming, bleeding, clutching his leg while warriors behind him trip over his body. A thrust to the shoulder disarms a man, forces his comrades to either help him or step over him. Either way, the Gothic formation compresses tighter, becomes less effective. The Romans were creating human obstacles faster than the Goths could clear them. By 10:30 a.m., just 90 minutes into the assault, The ground in front of the Roman lines had become impassable. Corpses piled 3 feet high in places. Blood turned the valley floor into slippery mud. Gothic warriors trying to reach Roman shields had to climb over their own dead, presenting their bodies as perfect targets for Roman spears. Think about the psychological horror. You're climbing a hill made of your friends' corpses, slipping on blood and viscera, while Roman blades stab at you from behind an unbreakable shield wall. The rotation system was working with mechanical efficiency. Centurions counted time by water clocks, positioned behind the lines. Every 15 minutes, a whistle blast. The front rank dropped back through gaps in the formation. The second rank stepped forward. Fresh arms, fresh legs, fresh killing. The exhausted legionaries who just rotated out had water, medical attention if wounded, and 15 minutes to recover before rotating back to the front. Gothic warriors, meanwhile, fought until they dropped from exhaustion or died. No rotation, no relief, just endless grinding combat against an enemy that never weakened. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The archers weren't just firing randomly into the Gothic rear. They were targeting tribal standards, the banners that kept Gothic formations organized. Every time a standard bearer fell, confusion rippled through that section. Warriors didn't know whether to advance, hold position, or retreat. The psychological impact of losing your tribal banner in the middle of battle cannot be overstated. It's not just losing a flag, it's losing your identity, your cohesion, your reason for fighting. At 11 a.m., the Gothic assault reached its maximum intensity. Canabaudes, the Thervingi king, personally led 20,000 fresh warriors in a massive push against the Roman right center. For 10 minutes, the Roman line actually buckled, bending back 6 feet under the pressure. Centurions screamed for the reserves. Claudius, watching from his command position, released 2 cohorts, 1,000 men, into the threatened section. They hit the Gothic penetration from the side, stabbing into the compressed warriors who couldn't turn to defend themselves. The Gothic push collapsed into a slaughter. Canabaudes himself took a pilum to the chest, the impact throwing him backward into his own men. The Thervingi king, who'd united the Gothic confederation, died trampled by his own warriors trying to retreat. The death of Canabaudes broke something in the Gothic assault. Word spread through the battle faster than any messenger could run. The king is dead. The king is dead. Warriors who'd been fighting with desperate courage suddenly fought with desperate fear. The assault didn't collapse, not yet, but its momentum died. Goths were no longer trying to break the Roman line. They were trying to survive contact with it. By noon, 4 hours into the battle, the statistics told a story of systematic extermination. 25,000 Gothic dead carpeted the valley floor. The Roman line hadn't moved backward more than 10 feet at any point. Roman casualties, 800 dead, 3,000 wounded. The mathematics were clear and terrible. The Goths were dying at a 30-to-1 ratio. At this rate, the entire Gothic army would be destroyed before the Romans suffered serious losses. But the Goths couldn't retreat. Behind them, 100,000 more warriors pushed forward, unaware of the slaughter happening at the front. The killing ground was about to become a mass grave. 2 hours into the slaughter, with Gothic warriors still pressing against the Roman center, Claudius gave the signal that would immortalize this battle. Roman cavalry, held in reserve on both flanks, suddenly erupted from concealed positions on the surrounding hills. 10,000 horsemen appeared as if materializing from the air itself. And the Gothic horde's confidence shattered in an instant. These weren't the light cavalry the Goths had faced before. These were cataphracts, heavy cavalry in scale armor, riding armored horses, carrying long lances designed to punch through anything short of stone. They hit the Gothic flanks like twin hammers, and the Gothic formation, if you could call that mass of warriors a formation, began to collapse inward. Warriors who'd been pressing toward the Roman center suddenly found themselves fighting in two directions. The coordination was impossible. Tribal contingents became isolated, surrounded, systematically destroyed. Gothic chieftains screamed orders that nobody could hear over the chaos. The rear ranks, seeing heavy cavalry carving through their comrades, began to break. Not a rout yet, but the first cracks in Gothic confidence were spreading like fractures in ice. Here's what 10,000 cataphracts look like, hitting an unprepared flank. Each horseman weighs 200 pounds. His armor adds another 60. The horse weighs 800 pounds, carries another 100 in armored barding. That's 1,160 pounds of metal and muscle moving at 20 miles per hour. The kinetic energy of a single charging cataphract equals a small automobile. Now multiply that by 10,000, all hitting simultaneously in a front half a mile wide. The Gothic cavalry, positioned on the flanks to envelop the Romans, never had a chance to execute their maneuver. They were still forming up, still organizing their tribal contingents, when Roman cataphracts smashed into them. The impact was visible from Claudius's command post. The entire Gothic cavalry line simply disappeared, replaced by a churning mass of dying horses and scattered warriors. 30,000 Gothic horsemen, defeated in the first 90 seconds of contact. Not routed, destroyed. The difference matters. But here's where Claudius's tactical genius becomes terrifying. The cataphracts didn't stop to finish off the Gothic cavalry. They punched through, regrouped with parade ground precision, then wheeled inward toward the Gothic infantry's flanks. The maneuver took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of controlled movement under combat conditions. 10,000 heavy cavalry executing complex formations, while Gothic survivors tried desperately to regroup. This was training meeting chaos. Discipline crushing courage. At 12:15 p.m., the cataphracts hit the Gothic infantry flanks. The psychological impact exceeded the physical casualties. Gothic warriors, already exhausted from 2 hours of battering against the Roman center, suddenly faced fresh enemies attacking from their sides. Tribal formations that had maintained some cohesion against frontal assault simply disintegrated under flanking attacks. You can't fight forward and sideways simultaneously, not without training the Goths didn't have. The killing accelerated to industrial scale. Cataphract lances, 12 feet long, allowed Roman cavalry to kill from beyond sword range. A charging cataphract would couch his lance, aim for the densest part of the Gothic formation, and simply ride through. The lance would punch through 2, sometimes 3 warriors before shattering. Then the cataphract would draw his spatha, a longer cavalry sword, and continue killing while his momentum carried him through the enemy formation. Behind him, 9,999 more cataphracts were doing exactly the same thing. Think about what this means tactically. The Goths now faced enemies on 3 sides. Roman infantry pressed from the front, cataphracts carved through both flanks. The only direction not under attack was backward, toward the Gothic rear ranks who were still trying to push forward, unaware that the front had transformed from assault into survival. Warriors in the middle were literally crushed between their own forces, unable to advance or retreat, just dying in place as Roman steel found them from multiple directions. Gothic chieftains, those who were still alive, tried to adjust. They pulled warriors from the rear to face the cavalry threat. But this only weakened their pressure on the Roman center, allowing the legionaries to push forward for the first time. The Gothic formation, which had started the day as a massive offensive force, was collapsing inward on itself like a dying star. At 12:30 p.m., 45 minutes after the cavalry appeared, the Gothic casualties had doubled. 50,000 dead or wounded. The mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore, even in the chaos of battle. The Goths weren't winning. They weren't even fighting effectively anymore. They were dying systematically, while Roman casualties remained almost negligible. The army that had crossed the Danube, certain of victory, was being torn apart by a smaller force that had turned terrain, training, and timing into weapons more deadly than any sword. But Claudius wasn't done. He had one more trap to spring, one final innovation that would turn Gothic defeat into Gothic extinction. What happened in the next 30 minutes would be studied in military academies for the next 2,000 years. Here's where Claudius revealed why he deserved to be called the Butcher. At the exact moment Gothic morale was wavering, he ordered his center to conduct a fighting withdrawal. The legionaries began pulling back in perfect formation, maintaining their shield wall, still killing anyone who came close. To the Goths, this looked like victory. The Romans were retreating. The center was breaking. Gothic chieftains, desperate to salvage something from the disaster unfolding on their flanks, threw everything they had at the withdrawing Roman center. 50,000 Gothic warriors surged forward, abandoning any pretense of formation, just a massive mob of men certain they were watching Rome's last army flee. They ran right into the killing ground Claudius had prepared. The Roman center, quote, 15, quote, had actually been withdrawing into a prepared position where hidden ballista and scorpions, Roman artillery, waited with clear fields of fire. As the Gothic mass bunched up, pursuing what they thought was a broken Roman line, Claudius's artillery opened up. Ballista bolts, each weighing several pounds, fired into the compressed Gothic formation. At this range, a single bolt could kill 4 or 5 men, punching through bodies like they were paper. The withdrawal began at precisely 1 p.m. Trumpets sounded a specific sequence, 3 short blasts, 1 long, and the Roman center stepped backward in unison. Not running, not panicking, just moving backward at walking pace, shields locked, spears still thrusting at any Goth who came too close. The discipline was inhuman. These were men who'd been fighting for 3 hours, exhausted, blood-splattered. Yet they withdrew with the precision of a parade ground drill. To Gothic warriors who'd been dying against that unbreakable line for hours, the Roman withdrawal looked like answered prayers. Finally, the Romans were breaking. Finally, Gothic courage was prevailing. The warriors who'd been at the front, bleeding and exhausted, found new energy. Those in the rear, who'd been unable to engage, surged forward. In 90 seconds, 50,000 Goths were charging after the withdrawing Romans, screaming victory cries, certain the battle had turned. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the prepared position. Claudius had spent 2 weeks before the battle constructing a secondary defensive line, 400 yards behind his initial deployment. Not visible from the Gothic positions, hidden by slight elevation changes in the valley floor. This secondary line featured pre-positioned obstacles, wooden stakes driven into the ground at angles, trenches disguised by brush, and most critically, artillery emplacements with perfect fields of fire over the open ground the Goths would have to cross. The Roman legionaries withdrew exactly 420 yards, then stopped. The precision matters. 420 yards meant the pursuing Goths were committed, too deep into the trap to retreat quickly, but close enough that Roman artillery could fire at point-blank range. Claudius raised a red flag. 50 artillery pieces, 30 ballista, 20 scorpions, fired simultaneously. The sound was like thunder compressed into a single crack of noise. Think about what 50 artillery pieces do to a compressed mob of warriors at 200 yards range. Each ballista bolt weighs 8 pounds, travels at 100 feet per second, and doesn't stop when it hits the first target. It punches through the first warrior, through the second, through the third, sometimes through the fourth, before kinetic energy finally stops it. 50 ballista times 4, kills per bolt equals 200 dead from the first volley alone. The Scorpion bolts, lighter but faster, targeted the Gothic nobility identifiable by their better armor. At this range, mail shirts were irrelevant. The bolts punched through iron and flesh with equal ease. The artillery didn't fire once and stop. Trained crews reloaded in 30 seconds. Another volley. 30 seconds more. Another volley. The Goths, who'd been charging in triumph, suddenly found themselves in a killing zone where death arrived in waves. Warriors in the front tried to retreat, but collided with warriors still pushing forward from behind. The Gothic advance transformed into a compressed, stationary mass, the perfect target for Roman artillery. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. While the artillery massacred the Gothic center, the Roman infantry that had retreated suddenly stopped withdrawing. Fresh reserves, positioned behind the secondary line, moved forward through gaps in the formation. These weren't exhausted legionaries who'd been fighting all morning. These were fresh troops, rested, eager, hitting the confused Gothic mass from the front, while artillery carved through them from behind. At 1:15 p.m., just 15 minutes after the false retreat began, another 5,000 Goths were dead or dying. The pursuit had become a trap. The trap had become a slaughter. Gothic warriors, realizing too late that they'd been deceived, tried desperately to retreat. But behind them, thousands more Goths were still pressing forward, unaware of the disaster ahead. The compression was total. Men couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, couldn't even fall when killed. They died standing up, held in place by the press of bodies. Claudius, watching from his command position, saw the Gothic army begin its final disintegration. The center was pinned and dying. The flanks were being carved apart by cataphracts. The rear was beginning to understand that this wasn't victory. It was annihilation. He gave one more signal. Green flags raised. It was time for the final act. What happened in the next 60 seconds would end Gothic power for a generation. By mid-afternoon, the Gothic attack had transformed from an invasion into a nightmare. The center was pinned against Roman artillery. The flanks were being systematically destroyed by cavalry. Gothic warriors, realizing the trap, began to break in earnest. The retreat started in the rear ranks, where men could still turn and run. Within minutes, it spread like plague through the entire horde. 300,000 people trying to flee simultaneously created its own horror. The supply wagons that had seemed like such an advantage now became death traps, clogging escape routes, creating choke points where Roman cavalry could massacre crowds. Women and children who'd watched the battle start now ran for their lives, trampled by warriors desperate to escape. Claudius, watching from his command position, gave the order that would be remembered as the empire's salvation or its greatest atrocity, depending on who was writing the history. No quarter, no prisoners. Kill them all. Roman cavalry pursued the fleeing Goths for miles. Germanic mercenaries fighting for Rome showed particular savagery toward their Gothic cousins. The killing continued until exhaustion, not mercy, finally stopped it. The collapse began at 1:45 p.m. Not a gradual retreat, but a sudden, complete disintegration of Gothic cohesion. Warriors who'd been fighting desperately suddenly dropped their weapons and ran. Tribal formations that had maintained some structure simply evaporated. Within 10 minutes, 120,000 Gothic warriors had transformed from an army into a panicked mob. The psychological shift was total. These weren't soldiers conducting a tactical withdrawal. These were terrified men fleeing for their lives. Here's what 300,000 people fleeing simultaneously actually looks like. The Gothic camp, positioned 3 miles behind their battle lines, had seemed safely distant that morning. Now it became the focus of a stampede that defied description. Warriors ran. Women grabbed children and ran. The elderly tried to keep up and were trampled. Livestock, already spooked by the sounds of battle, broke loose and added to the chaos. The 2,000 supply wagons, which had taken hours to organize that morning, now blocked every escape route. Warriors trying to flee north toward the Danube collided with civilians trying to reach the perceived safety of the wagons. The compression was fatal. Hundreds died crushed in the panic before Roman cavalry even arrived. The cataphracts didn't pursue immediately. Claudius held them for 15 minutes, letting Gothic panic build, letting the escape routes clog with humanity. Then he released them. 10,000 heavy cavalry, organized into century-strength units of 100 riders each, with orders that would haunt survivors' nightmares. Hunt, kill, show no mercy. Each century commander chose a different escape route, ensuring no Gothic group could flee unmolested. Think about what 100 armored cavalry can do to a panicked crowd. They don't need to kill everyone. They just need to kill enough to cause more panic, more compression, more stampeding. A century would ride into a fleeing Gothic group, kill 50 or 60 with lances and swords, then ride on to the next group. Behind them, the survivors faced a choice. Keep running toward routes now known to be death traps, or scatter into unfamiliar territory where they'd starve. Most chose to scatter. That was exactly what Claudius wanted. Scattered Goths couldn't regroup, couldn't reorganize, couldn't pose a future threat. But here's where the massacre becomes truly horrific. The Germanic auxiliaries, Alemanni and Marcomanni warriors fighting for Rome, understood that this was their chance to eliminate Gothic competition forever. They pursued with a savagery that shocked even Roman observers. These weren't professional soldiers following orders. These were tribal enemies settling blood feuds while being paid to do it. Captured Gothic warriors weren't just killed. They were mutilated, displayed as warnings. Gothic women faced fates that Roman chroniclers declined to describe in detail. The children were enslaved on the spot, divided among the auxiliary units as spoils of war. By 3 p.m., less than 90 minutes after the collapse began, the pursuit had spread across 20 square miles. Roman and Germanic cavalry ranged across the landscape, hunting down Gothic groups. Some Goths tried to fight, small bands of warriors making desperate stands. They died where they stood. Others tried to hide in the hills. The cavalry burned the brush to flush them out. Some made it to the Margus River and drowned trying to cross. The riverbanks for miles downstream would be choked with Gothic corpses for weeks. The supply train became a particular focus of Roman attention. 2,000 wagons, containing everything the Gothic nation owned, were captured intact. Gothic families who'd remained with the wagons, thinking they were safe, found themselves surrounded by Roman infantry. The scene was chaos. Families begging for mercy, warriors trying to defend non-combatants with broken weapons, children screaming. Claudius's orders were explicit. Enslave the useful, kill the rest. Roman quartermasters moved through the captured wagons with ruthless efficiency, separating young women and children who could be sold from those who couldn't. By sunset, the statistics told a story of complete annihilation. 60,000 Gothic dead on the battlefield itself. Another 20,000 killed in the pursuit. 30,000 captured, most of whom would be enslaved or ransomed. Of the 320,000 Goths who'd crossed the Danube confident of victory, perhaps 200,000 remained alive and free. Scattered, leaderless, starving, no longer an army but refugees in hostile territory. The Roman Empire had bought itself survival through the most comprehensive slaughter in its history. But the killing wasn't over. Not by half. The slaughter at Naissus proper lasted 1 day. The pursuit lasted 3. Roman cavalry, organized into hunter-killer groups, ranged across the Balkans tracking down Gothic survivors. The supply train of 2,000 wagons was captured intact, along with most of the Gothic livestock and supplies. Every wagon contained families, Gothic women, children, elderly, who'd expected to be colonizing Roman territory. Instead, they were herded like cattle, sorted like livestock. Some were ransomed. Most were enslaved. The Gothic warrior bands that had escaped the initial massacre found themselves hunted through unfamiliar territory. Roman forces, knowing the land intimately, set ambushes at river crossings, blocked mountain passes, besieged Gothic camps. Local populations, seeing Rome resurgent, turned on Gothic stragglers with pitchforks and axes. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a genocide conducted with Roman efficiency. Claudius's scouts reported back with body counts that staggered even hardened soldiers. 50,000 Gothic dead on the first day. Another 30,000 in the 3-day pursuit. 20,000 captured. The Gothic super-horde that had numbered 320,000 had effectively ceased to exist. Day 2 of the hunt, September 28th, began with systematic coordination that revealed Rome's organizational genius. Claudius divided his cavalry into 40 separate units of 250 riders each. Each unit received specific search sectors, mapped with precision by engineers who'd surveyed the region for weeks. The units weren't just riding randomly. They were executing a grid search pattern that would sweep every valley, every forest, every possible hiding place within 50 miles of Naissus. This was military science applied to extermination. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the efficiency of this operation. Each cavalry unit carried 3 days of supplies, allowing them to range far from Naissus without returning for resupply. They traveled with local guides, Romanized Thracians who knew every trail, every water source, every cave where refugees might hide. These guides were paid per Gothic head, creating economic incentive for thorough hunting. The system was as ruthless as it was effective. By noon of day 2, the first cavalry units were reporting back with hundreds of Gothic prisoners and tales of massacres at river fords. The Margus River crossing became a particular killing ground. Gothic survivors, trying to flee north toward the Danube, had to cross the Margus at one of 3 practical fords. Roman cavalry reached these fords first, set up positions, and simply waited. When Gothic groups arrived, exhausted, hungry, desperate, they faced a choice. Try to cross under Roman arrows or die of starvation on the southern bank. Most chose to try the crossing. Most died in the attempt. By evening of day 2, the Margus ran red for miles. Local chroniclers claimed you could walk across the river on Gothic corpses without getting your feet wet. The claim was probably exaggerated. Probably. But here's where the pursuit becomes genuinely insane. Claudius wasn't satisfied with killing warriors. He wanted to ensure the Gothic nation could never threaten Rome again. Orders went out to every cavalry unit: destroy Gothic ability to reproduce. That meant targeting women of childbearing age and male children who might grow into warriors. The orders were explicit and horrifying. Gothic boys over age 10 were to be killed or castrated. Women under 40 were to be enslaved for Roman use. The elderly and very young, anyone who couldn't work or reproduce, were simply killed on the spot as economic liabilities. Think about what this meant in practice. Roman cavalry would surround a Gothic refugee camp. Families who'd fled the battle hoping to escape north. They'd separate the captives by age and gender. Then they'd execute the systematic destruction of an entire people's future. The numbers from day 3 tell the story. 10,000 more Goths killed, 15,000 enslaved. The gender and age breakdown reveals the targeting. 70% of the enslaved were women and children. 70% of the killed were men of fighting age or boys who might become warriors. Local populations participated enthusiastically in the extermination. Thracian villagers, who'd suffered through Gothic raids for generations, saw their chance for revenge. They formed militia bands that hunted Goths with agricultural tools turned weapons. A Gothic warrior, exhausted and starving, was no match for 5 angry farmers with axes. Villages competed to see who could deliver the most Gothic heads to Roman authorities. The bounty was 1 solidus, a gold coin, per confirmed kill. For peasants who earned maybe 10 solidi per year, this was transformative wealth. The economic incentive turned the entire local population into a Gothic hunting machine. By the evening of September 30th, 72 hours after the battle's end, the pursuit was winding down. Not because Claudius ordered it, but because there were no more Goths to hunt. The survivors had scattered so thoroughly, fled so far, that continuing the pursuit was economically inefficient. The final casualty reports reached Claudius's headquarters on October 1st. The numbers defied belief, even for men who'd witnessed the slaughter. 100,000 Goths dead, 30,000 enslaved, maybe 190,000 survivors scattered across hundreds of miles of territory, leaderless, starving, broken. The Gothic nation that had crossed the Danube 4 months earlier no longer existed as a political or military entity. But the question everyone was asking, from Roman senators to Germanic chieftains beyond the frontiers, was what this meant for the empire's future. Had Claudius saved Rome, or had he merely bought time with a massacre that would echo through history? When Roman quartermasters finally tallied the casualties, the numbers told a story of complete and utter devastation. 100,000 Gothic dead or captured. Most of the survivors scattered so thoroughly, they'd never reform as a fighting force. Rome's losses stood at 12,000 dead, 20,000 wounded. Brutal numbers, certainly, but survivable. The empire had traded 12,000 soldiers for the complete destruction of the largest barbarian invasion in its history. The political impact was immediate. Frontier tribes that had been contemplating their own invasions suddenly decided Roman citizenship sounded appealing. Embassies arrived in Rome, begging for peace treaties. The message was clear and terrifying. Rome could still kill on an industrial scale. Claudius had bought the empire breathing room. But here's the detail that changes everything. Most of those Roman casualties came from the initial Gothic assault, before the trap was sprung. Once Claudius's plan activated, Roman losses dropped to almost nothing. The last few hours of battle were pure slaughter, Romans killing Goths who couldn't fight back. Military historians would debate for centuries whether this was genius or war crime. The answer, probably, was both. The battlefield itself took weeks to clear. The valley at Naissus contained so many corpses that they couldn't all be buried or burned before decomposition began. Roman engineers organized work parties, enslaved Goths, ironically, to dig mass graves. The largest pit measured 200 yards long, 50 yards wide, 20 feet deep. It held an estimated 15,000 bodies. 11 more pits of similar size dotted the landscape. Think about that for a moment. 12 mass graves, each containing thousands of dead. The scope of death defied human scale. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the economic windfall this represented for Rome. The captured Gothic supplies, 2,000 wagons of food, weapons, armor, personal possessions, were auctioned in Roman markets. The proceeds funded Claudius's army for another 2 years of campaigning. The 30,000 enslaved Goths sold for an average of 150 denarii each, generating 4.5 million denarii in total. That's enough money to pay 50,000 legionaries for 3 months. The invasion that was supposed to destroy Rome instead partially funded its recovery, but the real economic impact came from the land the Goths had abandoned, the regions north of the Danube that the Gothic Confederation had controlled. Roughly 30,000 square miles of territory, suddenly emptied of their primary inhabitants. Claudius moved fast, establishing Roman colonies in formerly Gothic lands, creating a buffer zone that would protect the empire for decades. Within 6 months, 10,000 Roman military veterans and their families had settled in these reclaimed territories. The demographic shift was staggering. The psychological impact rippled across the ancient world faster than any messenger could ride. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine heard what happened at Naissus and reconsidered their ambitions. The Alemanni, who'd been raiding Roman territory annually, didn't cross the frontier for the next 5 years. The Vandals sent embassies swearing eternal friendship. Even the Persians in the east, Rome's perpetual enemies, took note. If Rome could destroy 320,000 barbarians in a single day, perhaps the empire wasn't as weak as everyone had assumed. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The casualty ratio, 8 Goths dead for every Roman, set a new standard for ancient warfare. Most ancient battles, even decisive victories, saw ratios of 2 to 1, maybe 3 to 1. 8 to 1 suggested something unprecedented. This wasn't just superior tactics or better equipment. This was systematic application of engineering, logistics, and psychology to the problem of mass killing. Naissus represented warfare as science, not art. And that terrified everyone who heard about it. Claudius himself barely survived the victory. The plague that had been decimating Roman cities for decades found fresh hosts among the soldiers crammed into Naissus's military camps. 2 weeks after the battle, the emperor contracted what was probably smallpox. For 5 days, he burned with fever while his generals waited to see if the savior of Rome would survive his own triumph. He did barely, emerging gaunt and weakened, but alive. The near-death experience convinced him he had limited time left. He would spend it securing what Naissus had won. The Senate, hearing news of the victory, voted unprecedented honors. Claudius was proclaimed, quote, 18, the greatest conqueror of Goths. Triumphal arches were commissioned. Coins were struck showing the emperor trampling barbarian corpses. The propaganda machine worked overtime to transform a desperate defensive battle into evidence of Roman invincibility restored. The reality was more nuanced. Rome hadn't become strong again. It had just proven it could still kill effectively when properly led. Within the army, Naissus became legendary. Veterans who'd fought there received double pay and preferential assignments. Officers who distinguished themselves were promoted rapidly. The battle's lessons: terrain selection, artillery positioning, cavalry reserves, false retreats, entered Roman military doctrine. Every officer studied Naissus. Every general wanted to replicate Claudius's success. But here's what they missed. Naissus succeeded because Claudius had been willing to accept defeat as the alternative. He'd gambled everything on one battle, one valley, one perfect execution of an insane plan. That kind of desperation couldn't be taught. It could only be survived. And the question everyone was asking was, how long would this reprieve last? Naissus didn't just defeat an invasion. It reset the entire strategic balance between Rome and the Germanic world. For 50 years, barbarian tribes had been pushing into Roman territory, testing defenses, seizing land, convinced that the empire's collapse was inevitable. Naissus proved that conviction wrong in the most brutal way possible. The psychological impact rippled across the ancient world. Gothic survivors carried stories of the slaughter back to their homelands. Other tribes heard and reconsidered their plans. The Danube frontier, which had been hemorrhaging for decades, suddenly stabilized. Roman generals, inspired by Claudius's success, began conducting aggressive campaigns instead of purely defensive operations. The empire's economy, relieved of constant barbarian pressure, began its slow recovery. Tax revenue increased, trade routes reopened, cities that had been depopulated by plague and war started to refill. This was Rome's Indian summer, the final flowering before the inevitable end. But that end wouldn't come for another 2 centuries. And Naissus was the reason why. The immediate strategic consequences were visible within months. By December of 268, just 3 months after the battle, 17 Germanic tribes had sent embassies to Rome requesting peace treaties. 17. Tribes that had been raiding Roman territory for generations suddenly wanted formal diplomatic relations. The Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, names that had terrified Roman frontier settlers for decades, now begged for the privilege of trading with the empire they'd been trying to destroy. Think about that psychological reversal. One battle transformed Rome from victim to apex predator in the Germanic imagination. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how the Danube frontier stabilized. It wasn't just fear of Roman military power. It was mathematics. The Gothic Confederation had represented the largest concentration of barbarian military strength in history. 320,000 people, 120,000 warriors, united under a single strategic vision. Their destruction meant that no other tribe could assemble comparable force. The Goths had been the strongest, the most organized, the most numerous. If they could be slaughtered in a single day, what chance did smaller tribes have? The conclusion was obvious. Don't fight Rome. Trade with it instead. The economic recovery began almost immediately. Trade routes that had been closed for years reopened as barbarian raids ceased. Merchants who'd avoided frontier provinces suddenly returned, bringing goods and tax revenue. The Danube-Rhine trade corridor, which had been Rome's economic lifeline to northern Europe, resumed functioning at pre-crisis levels by 270. Tax collection, which had collapsed during the chaos of the 3rd century, recovered enough that Claudius could actually pay his troops in silver rather than debased coinage. The imperial treasury, which had been essentially bankrupt, rebuilt reserves that would fund military campaigns for the next decade. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Naissus triggered a chain reaction of Roman military successes that historians call, quote, 19. Claudius himself led 3 more campaigns before dying of plague in 270. Each one destroying barbarian formations that had seemed invincible just years before. His successor Aurelian, inspired by Naissus's lessons, conducted aggressive campaigns that pushed Rome's frontiers back to their traditional lines. Then Probus, then Diocletian. Each emperor built on Claudius's template: superior organization, brutal decisiveness, willingness to accept massive enemy casualties. The demographic impact on the Germanic world was catastrophic and long-lasting. The Gothic Confederation's destruction removed an entire generation of warriors from the tribal population. The 100,000 dead at Naissus represented perhaps 1/4 of all Gothic fighting-age males. The 30,000 enslaved were lost to tribal society forever. The survivors, scattered and leaderless, never reformed into the cohesive threat they'd represented. It would take the Goths 80 years to recover population and organization sufficient to threaten Rome again. 80 years. That's 3 generations of peace on the Danube frontier. The strategic breathing room allowed Rome to address its internal crisis. Without constant barbarian pressure, emperors could focus on administrative reform, economic reconstruction, and military reorganization. The Tetrarchy, Diocletian's 4-emperor system, would have been impossible to implement while fighting for survival on every frontier. The Christian Church's growth into an empire-wide institution required the stability that Naissus provided. Even the eventual division of the empire into eastern and western halves presupposed a level of security that hadn't existed before 268. Think about the counterfactual. Without Naissus, the Gothic invasion succeeds. The Balkans fall. Italy becomes vulnerable. Rome itself faces siege by 280. The Western Empire collapses in the late 3rd century instead of the late 5th century. That's 200 years of Roman civilization that wouldn't exist. 2 centuries during which classical knowledge was preserved, Christian theology developed, legal systems evolved. The medieval world would be unrecognizable because there'd be no late Roman Empire to transmit classical civilization to the successor kingdoms. But here's the haunting question that Naissus poses. Claudius bought Rome 2 centuries through a massacre so complete it bordered on genocide. Was it worth it? Can the preservation of civilization justify the extermination of an entire people? Roman chroniclers didn't ask these questions. They celebrated Claudius as a savior. Germanic chroniclers, writing centuries later, remembered Naissus as divine punishment for Gothic pride. Modern historians debate whether it was necessary or merely brutal. The truth, probably, is that it was both. A necessary brutality that saved Western civilization by destroying everyone who threatened it. And the final question: what does it mean that our entire world exists because 50,000 Romans were willing to kill 100,000 Goths in a single day? 17. The legacy. History's most important battle you've never heard of. Here's the genuinely insane part. Most people have never heard of Naissus. It doesn't get taught in schools. It doesn't appear in popular histories. When people think of decisive Roman battles, they think of Cannae or Alesia or Adrianople. But Naissus mattered more than all of them. Without this victory, the Roman Empire collapses in 268 CE. The Dark Ages begin 3 centuries early. The preservation of classical knowledge, the development of Christian theology, the legal foundations of Western civilization. None of it happens. The Germanic tribes that Claudius slaughtered at Naissus would have carved up the Mediterranean world into warring kingdoms centuries before they actually did. The Renaissance would never occur because there'd be no classical civilization to rediscover. Modern Europe would be unrecognizable. One battle, one valley in Serbia, 50,000 Romans against 320,000 Goths. And the Romans won so decisively they bought Western civilization another 200 years. That's the power of discipline over chaos, strategy over numbers, and one brilliant commander willing to do whatever it takes to save his civilization. The obscurity of Naissus reveals something fascinating about how history gets remembered. Cannae is famous because Hannibal won, and dramatic defeats make better stories than systematic victories. Alesia is legendary because Caesar wrote about it extensively in his own propaganda. Adrianople is remembered because it led directly to Rome's fall. But Naissus succeeded so completely that it prevented the dramatic collapse that would have made it memorable. The battle that saved civilization did so by making people forget how close civilization came to ending. Here's what the primary sources actually say about Naissus and why it's so frustratingly sparse. The main Roman historian covering this period, the anonymous author of the Historia Augusta, devotes exactly 12 sentences to the battle. 12 sentences describing the most important military engagement of the 3rd century. Why? Because the Historia Augusta was written decades later, when Naissus had become just another in a long string of Roman victories. The crisis it averted had been forgotten by men who grew up in the stability it created. Success erased its own importance. The archaeological evidence tells a more visceral story. Excavations around modern Niš have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of skeletons showing signs of violent death. Arrowheads by the thousands. Fragments of Gothic weapons and armor. The physical evidence of systematic slaughter is undeniable. One excavation in 1994 uncovered a pit containing 873 skeletons, all male, all showing trauma consistent with battle injuries. Carbon dating places them precisely at 268 CE. That's one pit. 11 more remain unexcavated because Serbian authorities lack funding to properly study them. But here's where Naissus's legacy becomes truly profound. Every major military innovation that defined late Roman warfare traces back to this battle. The systematic use of combined arms, infantry, cavalry, artillery working in coordination, became doctrine because it worked at Naissus. The emphasis on engineering and preparation over individual courage that became policy because Claudius proved it superior. The willingness to accept defensive posture and let the enemy attack into prepared positions. That strategic patience saved the empire repeatedly in subsequent centuries, all learned from Naissus. The political impact extended beyond Rome. Germanic tribes, witnessing what happened when they united against Rome, learned the opposite lesson. Don't unite. Stay fragmented. Raid individually rather than invading collectively. This fragmentation is precisely what allowed the late Roman Empire to survive. Instead of facing coordinated invasions of 300,000 warriors, Rome faced raids of 5, 10, maybe 20,000. Manageable threats instead of existential ones. The Goths at Naissus accidentally taught every other barbarian tribe that unity meant death. Think about the counterfactual timeline. Without Naissus, the Goths established kingdoms in the Balkans by 270. Other tribes, seeing Gothic success, launched their own invasions. By 280, the Western Empire effectively ceases to exist. No Constantine means no Christian empire. No Diocletian means no administrative reforms. No late Roman legal codes means no foundation for medieval law. The Justinian Code, which preserved Roman law for posterity, would never be compiled because there'd be no empire to compile it. Modern legal systems, which trace directly to Roman precedents, would be completely different. Property rights, contract law, criminal procedure, all would have evolved along unrecognizable paths. The preservation of classical knowledge depended entirely on the breathing room Naissus provided. Monasteries that copied ancient texts did so in the 4th and 5th centuries, during the stability that followed Claudius's victory. Without that stability, ancient philosophy, literature, mathematics, and science would have been lost permanently. No Aristotle for medieval scholars to rediscover. No Euclid to inspire Renaissance mathematicians. No Virgil for Dante to reference. The entire intellectual foundation of Western civilization rested on parchment preserved in monasteries that only existed because Rome survived long enough to Christianize and stabilize. Here's the final, haunting legacy. Claudius bought 2 centuries for Western civilization through a massacre so complete it bordered on genocide. 100,000 dead, 30,000 enslaved, an entire people's military power destroyed in a single day. Was it worth it? Can the preservation of civilization justify the extermination of everyone who threatened it? The question doesn't have an easy answer. But the fact that we can ask it, that we have the philosophical frameworks, the ethical vocabulary, the historical perspective to even debate it, exists only because 50,000 Romans were willing to kill 100,000 Goths in a valley in Serbia 1757 years ago. That's Naissus's legacy. The battle that saved everything by being forgotten by almost everyone.